there is one thing Anika Nilles cannot do in Rush. And the strange part is, it has nothing to do with technique, nothing to do with speed, nothing to do with precision. Because when you look at what Anika has accomplished as a drummer, the question almost feels unfair. She has built her own identity through extraordinary control, musicality, creativity, and a deeply personal approach to rhythm. She is not simply another musician sitting behind a drum kit, but Rush is not simply another band. That is where the real story begins. Anika is entering a musical world shaped for decades by three extraordinary personalities: Geddy Lee, Alex Lifeson, and Neil Peart. And while Geddy and Alex remain the surviving creative pillars of Rush, Neil's presence is still woven into the band's history, arrangements, imagery, and emotional identity. So the expectation surrounding Anika is almost impossible. Some listeners may want to hear the familiar Rush songs reproduced as closely as possible. Others may want to hear what happens when a remarkable drummer brings her own voice into that music. And between those two expectations sits the question fans are now confronting. Can anyone truly step into Rush without being compared to Neil? The answer may be uncomfortable. Anika can play the parts, she can interpret the music, she can bring something new, but there is one thing no drummer could ever do. And understanding why may change the way we hear Rush's next chapter. To understand the pressure surrounding Anika Nilles, you first have to understand what Neil Peart represented to Rush. Neil was never simply the person behind the drums. For decades, his playing became inseparable from the band's identity. His intricate arrangements, powerful precision, lyrical approach to percussion, and unmistakable visual presence helped define what millions of listeners understood as the sound of Rush. That creates a challenge unlike almost any ordinary change of drummer. Anika is not walking into an empty chair, she is walking into history. Every fill can invite comparison, every transition can remind longtime listeners of how Neil approached the same musical moment. Every decision behind the kit can raise an uncomfortable question. Should this sound exactly like Rush used to sound? But there is another reality. Neil Peart's contribution was the product of decades of experience, creativity, writing, touring, recording, and personal evolution. His relationship with Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson was built over an extraordinary span of time. That history cannot simply be transferred to another musician. And that matters because Anika does not have Neil's history with Rush, and she never could. She has her own. That distinction is crucial. The challenge is not merely learning songs that Neil performed. It is stepping into music carrying enormous emotional meaning for people who have lived with those performances for years. For some longtime fans, hearing those songs without Neil may always feel different. That is understandable, but difference does not automatically mean disrespect, and it does not mean Anika has failed. It may simply mean Rush has reached a point where the past can be honored without pretending it can be recreated. Because Neil's shadow will always be there. The real question is whether Anika has to stand inside that shadow or whether she can create something of her own. And this is where Anika Nilles becomes especially interesting, because the more closely you listen to her musicianship, the clearer it becomes that she is not defined by one drummer who came before her. Anika has developed her own musical language. Her playing is known for precision, control, complex rhythmic ideas, dynamic phrasing, and an ability to treat the drum kit as a complete musical instrument rather than simply a source of impact. That matters enormously in Rush. This is music where the drums are not background decoration. They interact constantly with Geddy Lee's bass and Alex Lifeson's guitar. The rhythm section has to breathe, respond, push, pull, and create momentum. And Anika brings a different perspective to that conversation. She can respect the architecture of Rush's music while still allowing her own instincts to exist inside it. That does not mean changing everything. It means understanding that interpretation is part of musicianship. A technically perfect reproduction can preserve the notes, but an individual musician can also preserve the spirit while bringing a different emotional shape to the performance. That distinction is important because Anika does not need to prove that she can become Neil Peart. In fact, trying to do that could erase the very qualities that made her interesting enough to be considered for this role in the first place. Her precision is hers, her phrasing is hers, her musical instincts are hers, and her relationship with Geddy and Alex has the potential to create combinations that could never have existed with the original lineup. Of course, longtime Rush fans may still listen for familiar details. They may compare a fill, a groove, or a transition with Neil's original interpretation. That is inevitable. But perhaps the more interesting question is not, does Anika sound like Neil? It is, what does Rush sound like when Anika sounds like Anika? That is where the future becomes unpredictable. And that brings us to the one thing she simply cannot do. There's one thing Anika Nilles can't do in Rush, and fans are finally talking about it. So here is the answer. The one thing Anika Nilles cannot do in Rush is become Neil Peart, and that is not a criticism, it is a fact. She cannot recreate the exact person who wrote those drum parts, lived through those decades, developed that artistic voice, and built that extraordinary relationship with Rush's music. She cannot reproduce Neil's history, because history cannot be reproduced. She cannot recreate the exact emotional connection, millions of listeners we developed with him, because that connection belongs to another time. And perhaps most importantly, she cannot and should not erase her own identity in an attempt to make Rush sound like it never changed. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of this entire conversation. Neil Peart's drumming was not simply a collection of techniques that could be copied. His playing reflected his personality, experiences, musical influences, discipline, and evolution as an artist. Even if another drummer played every note exactly as Neil did, that musician would still not be Neil. The hands might reproduce the patterns, the history would remain impossible to reproduce. And this is why judging Anika entirely through the question of whether she can replace Neil misses something fundamental. She isn't replacing a machine. She is following an artist whose contribution became part of Rush's identity. There may always be fans who prefer the original recordings, or who find emotional comfort in hearing Neil's interpretations exactly as they remember them. There may also be listeners who are fascinated by what Anika can bring that is different. Both reactions can exist, and neither changes the central truth. Anika's greatest limitation may actually be her greatest responsibility. She cannot be Neil, she can only be Anika. And if Rush has a future beyond its history, that may be exactly what the music needs. And this is where the conversation becomes complicated, because when a legendary band continues without one of its defining members, comparison is almost unavoidable. Rush fans have spent decades listening to Neil Peart's playing. They know the arrangements, they know the fills. They know the pauses, accents, transitions, and tiny details that can make one performance feel different from another. So when Anika Nilles takes on that material, some listeners may naturally measure what they hear against what came before. That does not necessarily mean hostility toward Anika. Sometimes comparison is simply what happens when music carries that much history. But there is another side to the discussion. Some fans may prefer hearing a drummer bring genuine personality to the music rather than attempting to become a human recreation of Neil. And that raises an important question. What exactly should the standard be? If Anika reproduces everything exactly, some may argue that something human has been lost. If she changes too much, others may feel that the character of Rush has been altered. It is an almost impossible line to walk. And perhaps that is why the fairest way to judge her is not by asking whether she can make listeners forget Neil. She cannot, nor should she try. Instead, the more meaningful question is whether she understands the responsibility of playing this music while remaining an artist in her own right. That distinction matters, because Rush's legacy belongs to its past, but a living musical performance happens in the present. Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson bring their own history to every note, while Anika brings a completely different musical background and perspective. Together, that combination creates something that cannot simply be compared with a recording from decades ago. The comparison will probably never disappear. Neil's influence is too important for that, but perhaps the goal was never to silence the comparisons. Perhaps the goal is to give fans something new to listen to, without asking them to forget what came before. And that brings us to the bigger question. What could Rush become when honoring the past no longer means repeating it? Maybe the most important thing about Anika Nilles in Rush is not what she can reproduce. It is what she cannot and should not replace. Neil Peart's place in Rush belongs to history. His music remains, his performances remain, his influence remains, and for countless fans, the emotional connection to those years will never disappear. But Rush's story was never only about looking backward. It was always about movement, experimentation, change, and musicians pushing themselves into places they had never been before. That is why Anika's presence can represent something bigger than simply filling a drum chair. She can help demonstrate that honoring Neil does not require pretending he never left. It can mean respecting what he created while allowing the surviving members of Rush to explore what comes next. Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson already carry decades of musical history between them. Adding Anika's individual voice does not recreate the classic lineup. It creates a different combination, and different does not automatically mean lesser, it means different. Some fans may never feel the same emotional connection to Rush without Neil. Others may be excited by the possibility of hearing familiar music interpreted through a new musical personality. Both responses are understandable, because the emotional weight of Rush continuing without Neil is enormous. But perhaps that is precisely why Anika should not try to become him. There is only one Neil Peart, and there is only one Anika Nilles. The future of Rush, if it continues to unfold, may not be about replacing a legend. It may be about carrying the music forward without pretending the past can be recreated. And maybe that is the one thing Anika cannot do, and the one thing nobody should ask her to do. She cannot be Neil. She can only bring her own voice. And perhaps someday that will be remembered, not as the moment Rush tried to replace its past, but as the moment the band found a way to honor it while still moving forward. If you care about Rush, great drumming, and the musicianship behind the music, subscribe and join us. We're building a community of pure rock traditionalists and drum enthusiasts who care about how the music is actually made.